There's a rhythm to farm life that most people from the city never quite understand. It isn't dictated by the 9 to 5 or by HOA newsletters stuffed in plastic mailboxes. Out here, the sun is the timekeeper, the seasons the rulers, and the land the employer. My family's farm had been in our hands for 3 generations, tucked just outside the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood that had grown too fast for its own good. I loved it that way. At dawn, I'd sit on my porch with a mug of coffee so strong it could stand on its own 2 legs, watching the mist curl low over the fields. Chickens scratched near the barn, the cattle lowed softly in the distance, and the old red tractor leaned against the shed like a tired but loyal dog, peaceful, predictable. Honest. It was the kind of life where you could leave your truck unlocked, wave to passing neighbors on tractors, and borrow a wrench without worrying if it had come back. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was legacy. My grandfather had broken his back plowing these same fields with nothing more than stubbornness and an old mule. My father modernized it with tractors, irrigation, and sweat. I carried it forward, balancing tradition with the realities of an ever-spreading suburb pressing in on our borders. And that suburb, that's where the trouble started. When I was a boy, there was nothing but woods on the other side of the fence line. Deer would wander through, foxes prowled at night, and you could walk half a mile before hitting pavement. But over the years, developers carved it up into tidy cul-de-sacs, all with polished names like Maple Grove Estates and the Willows at Hickory Bend. Cookie-cutter houses sprang up overnight, identical porches with potted plants, garages stuffed with SUVs, and lawns clipped with military precision. Along with the houses came something else, an HOA. Now, I'd heard of homeowners associations before, but they had nothing to do with me. I didn't live in their subdivision, didn't sign their contracts, didn't owe them a dime. Still, their presence hovered at the edges of my farm like a storm cloud on the horizon. My farm was freedom, no rules about what color I painted my barn, no complaints if my rooster crowed before dawn, no fines if my grass grew an inch too high. Their world was the opposite: restrictions, bylaws, and the iron fist of uniformity wrapped in a glossy neighborhood newsletter. I figured we could coexist just fine. They could have their manicured lawns and mailbox inspections. I'd keep my mud boots and tractors. But I underestimated just how far their sense of authority stretched, and how one woman in particular believed the world revolved around her and her HOA badge. But before we get to her, let me tell you what life was like just before the chaos began. Every Saturday morning, I'd make my rounds across the farm. Check the fences. Feed the cattle. Walk the property with my dog, Rusty, a blue heeler with more energy than sense. He'd dart ahead, chasing field mice, always circling back like he was making sure I hadn't disappeared. The air smelled of fresh hay and diesel from the tractor. To me, it was heaven. My nearest true neighbor, an old-timer named Charles, would wave from his porch as he nursed his second pot of coffee. He was a widower, tough as a hickory knot, who'd been farming nearly as long as I'd been alive. We shared more than a fence. We shared stories, tools, and the unspoken bond of folks who lived off the land. City folks'll never understand this life, Charles would mutter. They think food comes from the grocery store and eggs come in cardboard cartons. They'll drive past your pasture and complain about the smell of cows, like they forgot that burger on their grill came from somewhere. I'd laugh, but he wasn't wrong. The suburb crowd had already sent complaints about tractor noise, dust from plowing, and even the smell of manure spreading season. They wanted the countryside aesthetic without the countryside reality. It was only a matter of time before one of them crossed the line. At night, I'd sit on my porch, watching the stars blink to life, untouched by the glare of city lights. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and the occasional coyote yipped in the distance. Peace wrapped around the farm like a quilt, and I was grateful. That gratitude was tested the first time I noticed strange tire tracks near my east field dot at first. I figured it was nothing a delivery truck, maybe some teenagers cutting through to joyride. But then I saw the tracks again. And again. Fresh, wide, and not the kind that belonged to farm equipment. They cut into my grass, pressed deep near the barn, and left ruts that my tractor bounced over the next day. Someone had been parking on my land. I shrugged it off. No harm done yet. Still, I made a mental note to keep an eye out. A farm is a man's kingdom, and the first rule is you protect your boundaries. What I didn't know then was that these tracks were the beginning of something bigger, uglier, and louder than anything I'd ever dealt with before, because soon I would meet the source of those tire tracks, and her name was Karen. But on that quiet night, sipping coffee under the stars, I couldn't imagine how drastically my peaceful farm life was about to change. The first time I saw her, I didn't know she'd be trouble. Truth be told, she blended in like any other face from the subdivision. Manicured hair, pressed clothes, a shiny SUV that looked allergic to dirt roads. It wasn't until I noticed where she parked that my eyebrows raised. She'd nosed her glossy black Escalade halfway onto the grassy strip by my east pasture, right where my grandfather used to mend fences on summer evenings. The truck's tires sank into the soft ground, leaving deep ruts that I knew I'd be smoothing out later. I watched from the porch as she stepped out, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and strutted across my field as if she owned it. Rusty, my blue heeler, barked once sharp, protective. She shot him a look like he was the nuisance, not the uninvited guest trespassing on my property. I called out, trying to keep my voice friendly. "Ma'am, you lost?" She turned, squinting against the sun, her hand resting on her hip in a way that told me she was about to say something sharp. "No," she replied flatly. "I'm right where I need to be." There was no parking left at the clubhouse, so I parked here. It's closer anyway. That was my first clue, clubhouse, which meant she was from Maple Grove, Estates, the new subdivision, with the freshly paved sidewalks and their ever-present HOA. I walked down the steps, Rusty at my side, his ears pinned back as he watched her. "This here's private property," I said, polite but firm. "Not overflow parking for your clubhouse." She gave a dismissive laugh. "Oh, please. It's just grass. I'm not hurting anything. Besides, I'm the head of the HOA parking committee. I think I know what's acceptable." That was the second clue. Not only was she from the HOA, she was one of those types. The self-appointed rule enforcer. The kind who thought bylaws gave her power outside her subdivision. "Well, around here," I said, "we don't do committees. This land belongs to me. I'd appreciate it if you'd move your car." Her smile thinned, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked, pulling a small notebook from her purse. I frowned. "Why?" "I just like to keep track of who I talk to," she said sweetly, scribbling something down. "I'll move the car this time. But you should know, this neighborhood has standards. Your barn." She gestured vaguely toward my weathered red barn, proud with age. "Doesn't exactly match the aesthetic. Some of us were talking at the last meeting about how it lowers property values." The word stung, though I tried not to show it. That barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was a piece of history, built by my grandfather's calloused hands, patched by my father, painted by me. Lower property values? To me, it was priceless. Rusty growled low in his throat. Picking up what I was feeling, Karen snapped her notebook shut and strutted back toward her SUV, heels sinking into the soft earth. She climbed in, revved the engine, and shot a spray of mud as she spun her tires out of the rut she'd made. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, watching her taillights disappear toward the subdivision. "Standards," I muttered under my breath. She's got no idea what standards really mean. That should have been the end of it. A one-off encounter. City folks did dumb things all the time. You just shake your head and move on. But Karen wasn't wired that way. The following week, it happened again. Same escalade. Same patch of grass. Only this time, she'd parked even closer to the barn, like she was testing how far she could push. I was feeding the cattle when I spotted her. She was out of the SUV, phone pressed to her ear, pacing as if she were in charge of the world. Rusty barked again, and this time she barked back, "Quiet, mutt." Before resuming her conversation, I dropped the feed bucket, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked over. "Ma'am, I told you once already. This isn't your parking lot." She held up a finger 1 minute, without even looking at me. My blood boiled. When she finally clicked her phone off, she turned with a smile as fake as plastic flowers. "I told the board about your little concerns," she said. "We decided it's not a big deal. It's just temporary parking until the clubhouse expansion is finished. You don't mind being a good neighbor, do you?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Listen carefully. I'm not on your board. I don't live under your rules. This land is mine. Park here again, and you won't like the outcome." Her eyebrows arched, like she was surprised someone dared speak back. "Oh, I'll park wherever I see fit. And if you think your little farm makes you exempt from community standards, think again. We can file complaints. We can involve the county. You're outnumbered here." And with that, she turned and strutted back to her SUV. Rusty barked once more, as if echoing my thoughts. Trouble had arrived on my doorstep, and its name was Karen. From that day on, I started keeping a notebook of my own. Dates, times, pictures. Because something in my gut told me this woman wasn't going away anytime soon. And Lord, was my gut right? Some people test boundaries with curiosity, like a child seeing how far they can reach before a parent says no. Others test them out of spite, daring you to push back so they can dig in deeper. Karen was the latter. Every encounter with her carried the same smug undertone. "Your rules don't apply to me." By the third week of her overflow parking, I realized it wasn't just convenience, it was defiance. Each time I asked her to move, she came back with sharper words, longer excuses, or outright dismissals. And every time she drove away, she left a new set of ruts carved deep into my field like scars. I tried patience. Lord knows, I tried. But patience only works on folks willing to meet you halfway. Karen didn't have halfway in her vocabulary. The confrontation that pushed us past civility happened on a Thursday evening in early spring. Just finished moving hay bales into the barn, the sun sinking low enough to paint the sky in streaks of pink and orange. Rusty, ever watchful, barked from the edge of the pasture. At first, I thought he'd spotted a deer. Then I heard it, the low rumbling purr of a luxury SUV engine. There it was again. The Escalade. Parked bold as brass, this time not by the clubhouse, not at the edge of the field, but right in front of my barn doors, blocking them completely. I froze, disbelief giving way to anger. My tractor was still inside, hay bales stacked and waiting. Her vehicle wasn't just an eyesore anymore, it was a barrier, keeping me from doing my work. I stormed across the field, rusty clothes on my heels. Karen stood there in heels far too impractical for farmland, snapping photos on her phone. She angled it just so, capturing the barn behind her like it was some kind of rustic backdrop for a lifestyle blog. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. Voice sharp. She turned, clearly annoyed that I'd interrupted her photo session. "Oh, relax. I'm just getting a few pictures. This barn has a certain aesthetic charm. Don't you think it looks better in my HOA newsletter than hidden behind overgrown weeds?" I clenched my jaw. "You're blocking my barn." "Move your car." Karen smiled sweetly, as if speaking to a child. "I'll only be a few more minutes." You weren't using it anyway. I stepped closer, close enough for her perfume sharp, floral, out of place in the earthy smell of the farm to sting my nose. That's not the point. You don't park here. You don't walk here. You don't take pictures here. This is my property. She lowered her sunglasses, fixing me with eyes that glinted like steel. You really don't get it, do you? This whole area is part of our community now. The subdivision paid for road improvements. Our HOA maintains the sidewalks that lead right up to your fence. Without us, your property would be worth half as much. You should be thanking us, not scolding me. I barked a laugh, bitter and sharp. Thanking you? For tearing up my land with your tires? For acting like my grandfather's barn is just a prop for your newsletter? Lady, the only thing I should be thanking you for is reminding me why I stay as far away from HOA nonsense as possible. Her face tightened, the smile vanishing. Careful, she said, her voice dropping low. You don't want to make enemies in this community. The board listens to me. The county listens to us. We can make life very unpleasant for people who refuse to cooperate, Rusty growled, picking up on the tension. I didn't stop him. I pointed at her Escalade. Last warning, move your car. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence heavy as the humid evening air. Then she huffed, stomped back to her SUV, and slammed the door harder than necessary. Gravel spat from under her tires as she peeled away, leaving another pair of muddy scars behind. I stood there, fists clenched, chest heaving. That wasn't just a parking dispute anymore. That was a declaration of war. Later that night, Charles stopped by. He'd seen the whole thing from his porch and brought over a six-pack of beer like a piece, offering. Woman's got a mean streak a mile wide, he said, cracking a can. I knew the minute I saw her strutting around with that clipboard. Some people need control like they need air. And if they can't control their own lives, they'll sure as hell try to control yours. I downed half the beer in one gulp, the bitterness cutting the edge of my anger. I'm not looking for trouble, Charles. I just want to work my land in peace, he gave a slow nod. Then you'd better get ready. Because trouble's looking for you. And it's got a name. We sat in silence after that, watching the fireflies flicker across the pasture, both of us knowing this was just the beginning. The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper tucked into my mailbox. It wasn't in an envelope, just shoved inside like an afterthought. On the front, in neat block letters, it read, Notice of Known Compliance. I unfolded it, scanning the contents. It was printed on HOA letterhead, complete with their logo, a tree with perfectly symmetrical branches. The letter accused me of failure to maintain property standards, citing unsightly barn exterior, excessive grass height along fence line, and unregistered animals observed on property. My blood boiled? Unregistered animals? They were my cattle, my chickens, my farm. HOA rules didn't apply to me, but Karen was trying to make them. I crumpled the paper in my fist, tossed it onto the porch, and muttered to myself, All right, Karen, if it's a fight you want, you've got one. That was the day the line in the sand was drawn. From then on, every encounter with Karen wasn't just about property, it was about principle. And I wasn't about to back down at the notice of known compliance. Should have been laughable. It had no authority, no legal weight. It was nothing more than Karen's latest attempt to flex muscles she didn't have. But seeing it sitting there in my mailbox printed on that smug HO, a letterhead lit a fire in my chest. It wasn't just paper. It was a message. I'm coming for you, and come she did. Within a week, Karen had escalated from parking trespasses to a full-blown campaign. The first shot fired was a phone call from the county zoning office. Mr. Reynolds? The voice on the other end asked. We've received several complaints regarding your property claims of improper fencing, unpermitted structures, and, livestock sanitation issues. I nearly dropped the receiver. Sanitation issues? I clean my pens daily. Who's making these claims? The clerk cleared his throat awkwardly. Anonymous, sir. But the volume of complaints requires us to send out an inspector within the month. I knew damn well who. Anonymous was. The second shot came from a sheriff's deputy who pulled up my drive one afternoon while I was mending a fence. He was polite enough, leaning against his cruiser with a notepad in hand. Got a call about aggressive dogs, he said, jerking his chin toward Rusty, who was dozing peacefully in the sun. Rusty lifted his head, yawned, and thumped his tail against the dirt. Some minutes the deputy gave me a sheepish grin. Doesn't look aggressive to me, but I had to check. Caller said your dog lunged at her on multiple occasions. I clenched my jaw. Let me guess. Blonde Escalade, HOA badge. The deputy chuckled. You're not the first farmer she's complained about. Don't worry. I'll mark this one closed. Just keep your eyes open. Folks like her don't let up easy. By the third week, it wasn't just phone calls and deputies. It was Karen herself, marching up my drive with 2 HOA board members in tow clipboard carriers, both of them, with the stiff posture of men who thought rules were the backbone of civilization. Rusty barked from the porch, hackles raised. I wiped the sweat from my brow, leaning on my shovel as the trio approached. Good afternoon, Karen said, her smile stretched tight. We're here to conduct a property inspection. I barked a laugh. You're here to do it now? Per HOA regulations, one of the men chimed in. All adjacent properties must be held to the same community standards. Adjacent properties? I echoed, incredulous. I don't live in your subdivision. I didn't sign your bylaws. You have no authority here. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back in place. We'll see what the county has to say about that. Until then, we're documenting every violation. She pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of my barn, my tractor, even my cattle. I stepped forward, planting myself between her and the pasture. Take one more picture and I'll call the sheriff for trespassing. One of the clipboard men shifted uncomfortably, muttering, maybe we should, but Karen cut him off. No, he needs to understand that this isn't just his land anymore. This whole area is part of Maple Grove's image. If he won't cooperate, then we'll make sure the county forces him to. Her voice carried across the yard, sharp as barbed wire. Neighbors driving past slowed their cars, heads turning to watch. My farm, my sanctuary, was being turned into a stage for her performance. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice to stay calm. You've had your fun? Now get off my property. Last warning. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then one of the board members cleared his throat. Karen, maybe we should go. He's serious. Karen shot me a glare that could have cut steel, then spun on her heel. This isn't over, she hissed. Not by a long shot. I showed up at one of their meetings held in the Maple Grove clubhouse. Walking in was like stepping into enemy territory. Rows of neatly arranged folding chairs, a podium at the front, and half a dozen board members seated with their clipboards and bottled water. Karen's eyes lit up the second she saw me. Oh, look, she purred into the microphone. Our neighbor has joined us. I stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. I'm here because your board needs to hear the truth. I don't live under your rules. My farm is not your property. And Karen's campaign against me has gone too far. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others looked away uncomfortably. One board member, an older man with silver hair, leaned toward the microphone. Mr. Reynolds, he said cautiously, While it's true your property isn't technically part of Maple Grove, we still have to consider the visual impact on surrounding home values. Residents are concerned. I laughed bitterly. Concerned? About what, my barn? My cattle? This farm was here long before your subdivision. If you didn't want to live near a farm, you shouldn't have bought next to one. Karen leaned forward, her smile razor sharp. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. Perhaps you'd understand that if you weren't so stubbornly attached to the past. The board nodded, murmured, scribbled notes. I saw it in their eyes they weren't going to help. Karen had them wrapped around her finger. I walked out before they could dismiss me, my boots thudding against the polished floor, Rusty trotting loyally at my side. By then, frustration had hardened into something else. A simmering determination. Charles came by that night, listening quietly as I vented about the sheriff, the zoning board, the HOA. He sat in his rocker, hands folded on his cane, his eyes steady. You're learning what I've known for years, he said finally. The system doesn't care about folks like us. They care about paperwork, not principle. If you want peace, you'll have to make it yourself. I stared out at the darkened pasture, Karen's headlights still burning in my memory. I don't want trouble, Charles. I just want her gone. He gave a slow nod. Then you'll have to find a way to end this on your own terms. Before she drives you clean off this land. The next morning, I walked the fields with Rusty at my side, notebook in my pocket, anger in my chest. I'd asked for help. I'd gone through the proper channels. And every door had slammed in my face. That left me with only one option. Handle it myself. Something inside me finally snapped on a rain-sodden Tuesday, when the kind of small humiliations that had been chipping away at me for months all layered together and became too heavy to bear. It wasn't one single event, it was a stack of them, each like a pebble thrown at the same window until the glass finally shattered. That morning had started like every other. Coffee too black, boots too worn, Rusty already waiting by the barn for me to unlock the day. I was hauling a trailer full of seed to the far field when I saw the mess. Fresh tire ruts had crossed the corner where I parked the trailers. The grass was torn up and clumps of sod lay heaped like someone had taken a careless bite out of my land. On the other side of the drive, someone had scattered glossy flyers, same concerned neighbors propaganda, pinned to the fence with thumbtacks. Rain had made each pamphlet cling to the wood like a wet smear of shame. It felt personal, and it was personal. Then I saw the new addition, a camera on a pole, pointed straight at my driveway like a mechanical eye. It had been mounted on the property line, within my sight line, but technically on theirs. I recognized the little brand from a photo Karen had shown me before when proclaiming the subdivision's security initiatives. Someone had installed. It clearly aimed to record me. My truck, my comings and goings, an attempt to turn my life into evidence against me before anything even happened. That was when I realized it wasn't only about property values or aesthetics anymore. It was about control, about being watched and tried in people's minds and on social media before I ever opened my mouth. I climbed out of the tractor slowly, hands numb in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Rusty nosed my knee and looked up at me, eyes steady and somehow understanding. I grabbed the flyers, stuffed them into my pocket, and started walking toward the subdivision fence. When I reached the edge, a neighbor's kid, probably 12 or 13, peeked out from behind a trash can. "Mr. Reynolds?" he whispered, eyeing the camera. "My mom said if I say anything, Karen will kick us out of the neighborhood watch." He sounded small, frightened, already learning how to put someone else's power above what's right. I wanted to tell him to grow a backbone. Instead, I patted his shoulder and said, "Tell her this, we're all folks. Folks don't spy on folks. Not without a reason." He nodded like I'd given him something important, and then he ran. Hours later, as the sky cleared and the sun managed a weak apology through the clouds, I saw Karen's SUV where she'd never have the decency to leave it, parked at my entrance. Right at the gate, lights off but swaggering like a flag planted. 2 other cars from the HOA were parked across the road, and a small cluster of people milled around, whispering like a jury waiting for testimony. My first instinct was to walk over and demand they leave. My second was to call the sheriff and ask them to remove the camera and tell these people their presence on my land was trespass. Plain and simple. But I'd already been to the sheriff's office so many times that their word had grown thin. The deputy had been kind enough, but his hands were tied to paperwork and neutral language and the legal definition of probable cause. Karen knew how to work that system. She'd been maneuvering within its gray seams all along. There was a third voice, quieter but no less present, the one that had been gathering under my ribs since the first tire tracks. It said, in a dry, blunt way, "You can document this until the cows come home, or you can do something that ends the harassment on your terms." I thought about my grandfather, who used to say that a man must protect his homestead with the stubbornness of an old oak. He taught me to fix what can be fixed and to stand in the gap for what can't. He also taught me never to be the first to throw a stone, but to throw one if someone keeps pelting your roof. The next few days were a blur of running on adrenaline. I stayed up late at night editing footage from my phone, not professional camera work, just grainy clips of her SUV idling at the gate, of flyers stuck to the fence, of neighbors whispering as they pointed in my direction. I put everything into folders labeled with dates and times. Evidence, I told myself, for when the county or a judge finally decided to take notice. But part of me was also planning something else. It's hard to describe that part without sounding like some cartoon redneck vigilante. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about hurting someone. It was about sending a message so loud and clear that no one else in that subdivision would think they could come onto my land or shout down my livelihood again. I started checking the old equipment that lived behind the tool shed, the excavator we used for drainage work in the fall, the skid steer with its dented loader, the tractor with a bad starter that I kept as a backup. They were beaten and loyal like old battle horses. I cleaned the machines like a man polishes weapons he hopes never to use. I checked lines and pins and safety locks, not because I intended to do harm, but because any plan involving heavy machinery requires respect and care. Letting a machine have its head would be unforgivable. It wasn't over. The following week, I found flyers taped to my mailbox, my gate, even my fence posts. "Concerned neighbors against neglect," the heading read. Below were pictures of my farm crook shots of peeling barn paint, muddy cattle pens after a rain, weeds growing by the fence line. The captions were worse. "Is this what we want representing our community? Unhygienic conditions threaten our property values. Something must be done." I ripped each one down, crumpling them in my fists. Rusty whined, sensing my frustration. By then, the peace I once cherished was gone. My porch coffee tasted bitter. My evening walks across the pasture felt tense, eyes scanning for new signs of intrusion. Where there had once been quiet, there was now the constant hum of battle lines being drawn. Charles noticed, of course. He came by one evening, leaning on his cane as he surveyed the flyers I'd piled on the porch. "She's poking the bear," he said, shaking his head. "Trying to wear you down till you give in." "I'm not giving in," I growled. "This is my land. My family's land. I'll be damned if I let some clipboard warrior tell me how to run it." Charles gave a slow nod. "Good. Then you'd better be ready for the long haul. Folks like her don't quit till they're flat on their back." The breaking point of the escalation came one Saturday morning. I woke to the rumble of engines, multiple engines. Peering out the window, I saw a line of SUVs and sedans parked along the road. Spilling onto the edge of my field. At the front of the group stood Karen, bullhorn in hand. She wasn't just perking on my property anymore. She'd organized a protest. Neighbors! Her voice boomed across the pasture, carried by cheap amplification. This farm is a blight on our community. We demand accountability. We demand standards. A handful of HOA loyalists clapped, nodding like sheep. Others looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if wondering how they'd been roped into this circus. I stormed onto the porch, anger pulsing in my veins. "You've got 5 minutes to clear out before I call the sheriff," I roared. Karen lifted her chin, smug as ever. "Call them. We've already filed reports. The world deserves to see what kind of negligence you're hiding behind that fence." Rusty barked. Cattle lowed nervously, and for the first time, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. When you grow up on a farm, you're taught to handle your own problems. A busted fence? Grab some wire and fix it. A sick calf? Call the vet, sit up all night if you have to, and see it through. You don't wait for someone else to come save you. But Karen wasn't a down fence or a sick calf. She was something I couldn't fix with wire cutters and determination. And after the circus of her so-called protest, I realized this fight had gotten bigger than me. I needed backup. My first stop was the county sheriff's office. The same deputy who'd once checked on Rusty's aggressiveness was sitting at the desk, sipping coffee. He looked up as I walked in, recognition flashing across his face. "Reynolds," he said. "What brings you here?" I leaned on the counter, exhaustion heavy in my bones. "It's Karen. She's escalating. Trespassing, harassment, organized a mob outside my farm last week. I need this to stop." The deputy sighed, setting his mug down. "We've had calls from her, from you, from folks on both sides. You know how this works. We can't step in unless there's a clear violation of the law. She's on my land." I snapped. "That's trespassing." He nodded slowly. "And if you can prove she stepped across the property line without permission, we'll file it. But when it's her word against yours, it gets messy. Courts don't like messy." I rubbed my temples. "So what am I supposed to do? Let her run me out of my own farm?" His voice softened, almost apologetic. "Document everything. Photos, videos, times, dates, witnesses. You build a case, then maybe the county prosecutor will look at it. Until then, my hands are tied." So I documented every tire rut, every flyer, every time her SUV so much as grazed the edge of my grass. Rusty became my witness, sitting at my side as I snapped photo after photo, filling notebooks with dates and details. Still, it felt like bailing water with a thimble. My second stop was the county zoning board. If Karen was going to weaponize standards, maybe I could beat her at her own game. The clerk, behind the desk, a young man with hair gelled so stiff it looked like a helmet, barely looked up from his computer as I explained the situation. "Maple Grove HOA doesn't govern my property," I said firmly. "They're filing bogus complaints to force me into compliance. I need them to back off." He finally glanced up, unimpressed. "HOAs don't govern farmland, sir." "You're correct about that. But they can submit complaints to the county if they believe there's a violation. It's our duty to investigate, even if the complaints are false." He shrugged. "We can't make that call without inspections. And if our inspectors find nothing, the case closes." I leaned forward. "So you're telling me Karen can keep filing bogus complaints forever, and you'll keep sending people out here?" "That's the process," he said flatly. I wanted to reach across that counter and shake him until he understood what he was saying, but instead I just bit back the anger. Fighting the clerk wouldn't fix this. My third attempt was the HOA board itself. Figured maybe, just maybe, Karen's obsession wasn't shared by everyone. Surely there had to be at least one reasonable person on that board, someone who saw through her antics. Neighbors noticed the late-night tinkering. A few of the more sympathetic ones, farmers, mostly offered quiet advice or a beer on a porch. Charles showed up one evening with an oil rag tucked into his pocket and a knowing look. "You need to be careful, son," he said, settling into the old rocking chair by my barn. "People tend to think they can own what they read in a letterhead. You do anything you'll regret, and you'll be the one standing in court with your hands empty. But neither should you be walked over. There's a middle path." "What's the middle path?" I asked, tired and raw. He shrugged. "Make a move that's symbolic. Something that doesn't put someone in danger, but shows you won't be bullied. Something that settles the matter without turning you into a criminal." He didn't say the word excavator. He didn't have to. We both knew what he meant. His voice had the weight of a man who'd outlived fights and still kept some scars. I spent that night thinking of symbolic actions, which was, of course, ridiculous. Symbolism alone doesn't fix ruts or remove cameras. But symbolism has power. It shapes conversations and paints pictures in people's minds. If Karen wanted to run a campaign, maybe it was time someone ran a counter-campaign. Started to draft a manifesto in my head. Not a manifesto to post on social media, but a private list of what I would and would not do. I would not injure anyone. I would not destroy property recklessly. I would not become the very bully I hated. I would, however, take an action that made it painfully clear I owned this land and that I would do what was necessary to protect it. The decision didn't arrive in a flash. It set like concrete over the course of a week. I spent the days gathering witnesses without telling them what for folks who'd seen Karen's truck, who'd seen the flyers, who'd noticed the camera pointed at my driveway. I bolstered my documentation and had Charles watch as I placed cameras on my side of the fence to record anything coming from their direction. I spoke with a lawyer for an hour just to know my options. He was careful, like the sheriff useful, but slow. On a Tuesday morning, I walked out to the yard and looked at the machines waiting like patient giants. The excavator's cab was dusty, the hydraulic arms slightly stiff from disuse, but the engine hummed when I cranked it. I didn't climb in right away. I sat on the loader bucket and looked over the field at the subdivision where the manicured roofs glinted in the sun. I thought of my grandfather, of the barn, of Rusty steady breathing, of every petty flyer and every smug smile Karen had offered me. I made a promise to the land. Whatever I did would be decisive, proportionate, and aimed at ending the harassment, not starting a tragedy. I would act with the same careful, stubborn courage my family had always shown. Then I rose, the resolve cooling into something clear. That afternoon, I drove the tractor to the gate, hooked the chain through the link where their camera was attached, and pulled. I pulled enough to sever the cheap mount but not to injure anyone. I dragged the camera into my yard, set it on the ground, and sat beside it while neighbors from both sides gathered to see what would happen. Karen stormed down the road in stilettos, red-faced and furious, clutching her phone like a talisman. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. But the sound of her voice felt smaller than the machine I'd been tending to for days, the steel and gear and diesel presence that belonged in a field and not in pristine neighborhoods. Around us, people shifted. Some of her supporters looked uneasy. Others who'd been watching quietly finally found their voices and started speaking up for me. It was the start of my retaliation in tone and consequence, not in destruction. I'd taken back the watcher she'd set upon me. I'd done it without blood, without catastrophic damage. And yet it said everything that needed to be said. This land was mine. And I wasn't going to let her or her clipboard brigade use intimidation as a tool. As the crowd murmured and Karen's breath came fast and high, I looked across the divide and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The line had been drawn, Whatever came next would be louder, messier, and harder to control. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had moved from reacting to deciding. There are moments in life when a man knows he's crossed a bridge. That afternoon, with the camera at my feet and Karen shouting down the road, I knew I'd crossed mine. The thing about anger is that it doesn't stay hot forever. After a while, it cools, hardens, and becomes something heavier, something that sits inside you like a stone. That's where I was by the time I dragged Karen's little spy camera into my yard. The adrenaline of that day had faded, but the stone remained. I knew Karen wasn't finished, and I knew I couldn't keep waiting for county clerks, board meetings, or lawmen with tied hands to fix what was eating me alive. It was time to plan. I started with a notebook. Just a cheap spiral-bound pad, its cover stained with oil from the barn. I drew a line down the middle of the page and titled one side, What I Can Do, and the other, What I Won't Do. On the first side, I wrote, Use my land, use my equipment. Make it clear, make it loud. Embarrass her. End this. On the second side, I wrote, No physical harm. No reckless destruction. No escalation I can't control. The excavator sat at the back of my property, hulking and patient, like an old warhorse waiting for one last charge. It wasn't new. The paint had faded, and the engine coughed when you turned the key. But when the hydraulics kicked in, it still moved with a kind of power you don't ignore. I'd used it for drainage ditches, foundation work, and clearing the odd storm-felled tree. It wasn't a toy. It was muscle and steel and leverage made visible. The idea came not like lightning but like water dripping on stone. What if I used the excavator to show her and everyone else that I was done being her target? What if the sight of that machine in motion made her think twice before ever planting her tires on my grass again? And then, darker but undeniable, another thought. What if her precious SUV, the one she parked like a trophy at my gate, became the lesson? Not crushed into dust, not turned into a headline, but sunk, dragged, humbled. A symbol. For days I rehearsed it in my mind. The sound of the engine turning over. The groan of hydraulics. The way the bucket could slide under the frame of her car, not violently, but insistently. The earth giving way under the machine's weight as it shifted and dug. The shocked gasps of the neighbors, caught between outrage and awe. It was theater, really. A play where I had the lead role and the excavator was my stage prop. But before I could act, I needed to be sure I wasn't digging my own grave. I went back to Charles. He was sitting on his porch again, watching the evening lights settle over the fields. I told him what I was thinking, not every detail, but enough. Enough for him to know the shape of the plan. He didn't interrupt. He just rocked slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands folded around that old cane. Finally, he said, "If you do this, you better mean it. No half measures. Folks respect clarity, not tantrums. And you better be ready for the storm she'll stir up afterward." "I'm ready," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. You don't win by being louder, son. You win by being truer. Remember that. That night, I sat by the window, Rusty curled at my feet, and watched the glow of the subdivision. The houses twinkled like a Christmas display, neat and uniform, every lawn manicured to perfection. And there, at the edge, I could almost see her Karen, perched in her living room, certain she was winning. The thought made the stone in my chest heavier. So I decided. Preparation was half the battle. First, I made sure the excavator was ready. I topped off the diesel, checked the hydraulic lines, greased the fittings, and tested the lights. The engine roared after a few coughs, and I let it idle until it purred smooth. Second, I picked the spot. On the far side of my property was a low patch where rainwater always pooled. It wasn't a pond, not exactly, but soft enough that any vehicle left there would sink like a boot in quicksand. That would be the stage. Not destruction, but humiliation. A slow, sinking reminder of what happens when you disrespect a man's land. Third, I watched. I waited for her pattern. Karen loved a stage as much as I did, though hers was smaller. The entrance to my farm, the place where her SUV became a billboard of defiance. She parked there almost every Thursday, like clockwork, when she hosted her HOA meetings. She wanted the whole subdivision to see her little conquest. Thursday would be my day too. Hours leading up to it stretched thin. I went through my chores like a ghost, muscles moving but mind far away. My hands shook when I tried to eat. Even Rusty sensed something, pacing more than usual. Ears perked at every sound. I kept telling myself, this isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming dignity. It's about showing her that the farm is not her playground, not her stage, not her prize. Still, my stomach churned with what ifs. What if the sheriff showed up? What if Karen cried foul louder than ever, dragging me into court? What if my neighbors saw me not as the man who stood up, but as the man who snapped? The doubts piled high, but under them, steady and stubborn, was that stone in my chest. Heavy, solid, certain. When Thursday came, I rose before dawn. I stood in the barn doorway and watched the mist lift off the fields, the sky bleeding pink at the edges. Rusty sat at my heel, calm now, as if he knew it was time. I patted his head and whispered, "Let's finish this." Then I walked to the excavator. By mid-morning, the subdivision was buzzing. Cars lined the streets. I could see them from my fence, gathering for their weekly ritual of rules and gossip. And right on cue, Karen's SUV rolled up and parked at my gate, bold as brass, blocking my path like it belonged there. She climbed out, sunglasses perched on her nose, lips curled into that smug smile. She didn't even glance at me standing in the field. She knew I'd see it, and that was enough for her. Only this time. I didn't look away. I climbed into the excavator's cab. The seat was cracked, the levers worn smooth by years of use. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. A cloud of diesel smoke puffed into the sky. Heads turned from the subdivision. Neighbors paused on porches, their conversations faltering as the machine came alive. Karen froze mid-step, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. I gripped the levers, heart pounding in my chest, and eased the excavator forward. The steel treads clanked against the dirt, slow and deliberate, like the drumbeat of war. This wasn't anger anymore. This was decision, and as the machine rumbled toward her SUV, every eye in Maple Grove was fixed on me. The excavator rumbled forward, each steel tread biting into the dirt, announcing itself with a groaning growl that made the ground tremble. I could feel the vibration through the solace of my boots, through the cracked vinyl seat, through my chest. Karen's SUV sat smugly at my gate, polished black paint gleaming under the sun. She leaned against it with arms crossed, her mouth curved into the smirk of someone who believed she couldn't be touched. Until now. The neighbors were already gathering. Subdivision porches emptied, voices hushed, phones raised. The sight of that excavator rolling toward her vehicle was irresistible. Everyone knew something was about to happen, something no HOA rulebook had a page for. Karen's sunglasses slipped lower on her nose as the machine closed the distance. For the first time in months, I saw something in her expression that wasn't smugness. It was doubt. She pushed off the SUV and held out a hand like she could stop 40,000 pounds of steel with her palm. "Stop right there, Reynolds," she shouted, her voice cracking like a whip. "This is destruction of property. You'll regret this." But her words were drowned out by the roar of the engine and the screech of hydraulics as I pulled the levers. The bucket lowered slowly, deliberately, until its steel edge hovered inches from the gravel. I eased the machine forward again, the bucket sliding under the front bumper of her SUV like a blade slipping beneath armor. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Some neighbors cheered under their breath, while others covered their mouths in shock. Karen's smirk was gone now, replaced by wide-eyed fury. She ran to the driver's side, yanking at the handle, fumbling to get in. But I'd already lifted. The excavator's arm rose, and with it, the SUV tilted backward, tires spinning helplessly in the air. It groaned in protest, metal creaking, the undercarriage scraping against the bucket. Karen screamed, half rage, half disbelief, as if physics itself had betrayed her. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice shrill over the clatter of machinery. "This is a crime. This is," but her words were lost again as I swung the arm. The crowd gasped as the excavator pivoted, the SUV dangling like a toy in its grip. Slowly, methodically, I turned toward the low patch of earth I'd chosen days before. The soggy ground shimmered in the sunlight. Soft and waiting. The machine crept forward, carrying its unwilling passenger. Each step of the treads dug deep ruts into the dirt. Sweat ran down my back, but my hands were steady on the controls. This wasn't rage anymore. This was clarity. Rusty barked from the barn, a single sharp note. Like he was bearing witness. When I reached the edge of the patch, I stopped. The excavator hissed, steam rising from the engine. The SUV hung suspended, rocking slightly in the bucket's grip. Karen clawed at the passenger door, finally scrambling inside, but it was too late. I lowered the arm. The SUV slammed into the muck with a wet, sucking thud. The front tires sank instantly, swallowed halfway by the soft ground. Karen's scream echoed inside the cab, muffled and desperate. She tried to slam the gearshift into reverse, tires spinning mud like angry wheels in quicksand, but the more she fought, the deeper it went. The crowd roared, some laughing, some gasping, some recording every second with shaky hands. The scene was pure spectacle, half carnival, half battlefield. Karen's SUV tilted as the ground gave way. Mud oozed up around the doors, dark and merciless. The shiny black paint, once her armor, now looked ridiculous against the sucking brown earth. She pounded the horn, blaring in panic, her face twisted in disbelief. For the first time, she wasn't the master of the stage, she was the show. And everyone was watching. I killed the excavator's engine. Silence fell except for the frantic revving of her trapped SUV and the caws of distant crows. I climbed down from the cab, boots crunching on gravel, and stood with arms crossed, staring at her. "This is my land," I said, voice low but carrying. "You don't park here. You don't trespass here. You don't put your rules here." Karen's window slid down just enough for her red, furious face to appear. "You're finished, Reynolds. You hear me? I'll sue you for everything you've got. Her words choked off as the SUV lurched deeper, mud now licking the bottoms of her doors. Someone in the crowd laughed, and that laugh spread, contagious and merciless. Even the neighbors who'd once sided with her couldn't hide their amusement. The mighty HOA Queen was sinking, and no rule in her binder could save her. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just turned and walked back toward the barn, Rusty falling into step beside me. Behind me, Karen kept screaming, her SUV growling uselessly, her empire literally sinking into the dirt. For once, it wasn't my problem to fix. That night, the videos hit social media. I didn't post them, someone else did. Clips of the excavator lifting her SUV, of the crowd's gasps, of Karen's panicked face as the vehicle sank. The captions wrote themselves, HOA Queen meets Farmer Justice. Karen's SUV versus Excavator. Guess who won? Don't mess with the farm. By morning, the whole county knew. Karen wasn't feared anymore. She was a punchline. And me? I was finally breathing easy for the first time in months. Morning after the excavator showdown dawned crisp and golden, sunlight stretching across the pastures like a blessing. For once, I woke up without that knot of anxiety in my chest. Rusty patted at my heels as I stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt free. But peace never lasted long with Karen, her SUV still, set in the muck where I'd left it, tilted like a ship half sunk at sea. Overnight, the mud had tightened its grip, swallowing the tires up to the rims. The sleek black paint was streaked brown, the chrome dulled under layers of slime. Crows perched on the roof, cawing like they'd claimed it as their new roost. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen. Not yet. By mid-morning, the rumble of engines broke the quiet. 2 county sheriff SUVs pulled up to my gate, lights flashing, dust kicking up behind them. Neighbors came out onto their porches again, eager for the next chapter of the drama. Some had lawn chairs already set up like it was a county fair. The deputies climbed out, one tall and lanky, the other built like a barrel. Both of them looked toward the half-submerged SUV and then back at me, their brows raised. "You Reynolds?" The tall one asked. "That's me," I said, setting my coffee mug down on the porch rail. He scratched the back of his neck. "We got a call. Lady claims you used heavy machinery to, He glanced at his partner, who fought not to smirk. "Sink her vehicle." I crossed my arms. "On my property. After she parked there without permission." After months of harassment, the barrel-shaped deputy gave a low whistle as he squinted at the car. That's one way to handle trespassing. And then she appeared. Karen marched up the lane in a spotless tracksuit, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the morning heat, sunglasses shielding her eyes. She looked less like a victim and more like a general rallying for battle. "Officers!" She shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Arrest him immediately. He destroyed my property and endangered my life. He's a menace to this community." The deputies shared a look. The tall one sighed. "Ma'am, this is private farmland. Did you have permission to park here?" Karen sputtered. "Permission? I am the president of the HOA. I don't need permission." That got a laugh from the neighbors on the sidelines. One even clapped, and another muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Queen Karen strikes again." The barrel deputy pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't apply out here. This isn't subdivision land. Unless you've got a legal easement or written agreement, this gentleman had every right to remove your vehicle." Karen's jaw dropped. "You call that removal?" "He used an excavator like a barbarian. He could have killed me." "Were you inside the vehicle when he moved it?" the tall deputy asked. Her lips twisted. "Well, yes, but did he touch you? Threaten you physically?" "No, but then it's not assault. At most, it's a civil matter about damages to your vehicle. You'll have to take it up in court." Karen's face turned red as a beet. She looked like she was about to explode, but she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That afternoon, I got the first of what would be a stack of papers delivered by certified mail. Karen had filed a lawsuit claiming property destruction, emotional distress, and harassment. The language was flowery, dramatic, dripping with exaggeration, exactly what you'd expect from someone who thought HOA minutes were constitutional law. My lawyer, old Hank from town, nearly laughed himself out of his chair when he read it. "She's trying to sue you for malicious excavation," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Son, I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I ain't never heard that phrase before. She might as well sue you for hurt feelings." Still, we couldn't ignore it. The court date was set. In the weeks that followed, Karen doubled down. She called code enforcement on me, claiming my barn was structurally unsound. She tried to rally her HOA board to petition the county for fines. She even went door to door in her subdivision, collecting signatures for my removal from the community, but something had shifted. The videos of the Excavator showdown had gone viral, millions of views, thousands of comments, most of them laughing at Karen. People were making memes, dubbing her Excavator Karen. Kids at the local high school wore t-shirts with cartoon tractors dragging SUVs into the mud. Instead of rallying support. Karen was becoming a joke. Neighbors who once feared her now smirked when she walked by. Some even rolled their eyes openly. The queen had lost her crown. The court date finally arrived on a humid Friday morning. I wore clean jeans and a collared shirt. Karen showed up in a blazer 2 sizes too small, clutching a thick binder of evidence. Her lawyer slick, city type with shiny shoes did most of the talking. He painted me as a violent farmer with a vendetta against authority, a man who weaponized heavy machinery to terrorize an innocent homeowner. Karen dabbed at fake tears with a tissue, sighing dramatically for the judge. Then Hank stood up. Calm, steady, and sharp as a nail. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff knowingly parked her vehicle on my client's private farmland without consent. My client did not damage the vehicle, he simply relocated it to a part of his land where it became stuck due to natural conditions. Any damage was a result of the plaintiff's own actions when she attempted to drive it out." He slid a stack of photos across the bench clear. Time-stamped shots of her SUV parked across my gate, blocking access. Another neighbor had even provided video of Karen boasting, "He can't stop me. I'll park here if I want to." The judge flipped through the evidence, frowning deeper with each page. When Karen tried to interject, he held up a hand. "Mrs. Patterson," he said firmly, "you trespassed on private property. You escalated the situation. And frankly, this lawsuit is frivolous." Case dismissed. Karen's gasp echoed like a gunshot. She shot to her feet, finger trembling at me. "This isn't over, Reynolds. You'll pay for this." Yoel the bailiff escorted her out before she could finish. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. The Excavator video had made Karen infamous beyond the county, and now she was a story. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved in her face. "How does it feel to lose the case?" One asked. "Do you regret trespassing?" Another shouted. Karen shoved past them, screeching, "No comment." Before speeding away in a rental car, her SUV was still buried in my pasture, now half rusted and abandoned. I stepped into the sunlight, Rusty waiting faithfully by my truck. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift. Karen's reign was collapsing, and I hadn't just defended my farm, I'd shown everyone that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to dig deep, stand firm, and let the mud do the rest. The day after the court ruling, the air around my farm felt lighter. The fields looked the same rows of corn swaying in the breeze, Rusty chasing birds along the fence line, but the atmosphere had changed. For months, Karen's shadow had loomed over everything I did. Now it was gone. I leaned on the fence post, sipping coffee as the sun climbed higher. Across the road, the subdivision was quiet. No Karen marching door to door with clipboards, no HO as spies snapping photos of my barn. Just stillness. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe the storm had passed. Of course, Karen didn't vanish overnight. People like her rarely do. She made a few last-ditch efforts to claw back her authority. A letter to the county zoning board, claiming my farm equipment posed a community hazard, a rambling post on the HOA Facebook page accusing me of domestic terrorism with machinery. But nobody listened anymore. Her neighbors, once cowed into submission, now laughed at her rants. The video of her SUV sinking in the mud had stripped away her power. She wasn't the queen of the HOA anymore, she was a punchline. Memes spread faster than her threats. Somebody even edited her voice yelling, "This isn't over." Over footage of a tractor demolition derby. High school kids shared it on TikTok, racking up millions of views. Karen's name wasn't feared anymore. It was ridiculed. And that, more than any court ruling, was what finally silenced her. By midsummer, Her SUV still sat rusting in my field, tilted like a forgotten monument. The mud had hardened around the tires, the once shiny black paint dulled to gray. Birds perched on the roof, and weeds crept up the doors. I had offers to tow it out, but I always shook my head. "Leave it," I told anyone who asked. It's a reminder, and it was. Every time I saw it, I remembered that moment of clarity, sitting in the cab of the excavator, realizing I didn't have to bend anymore. I didn't have to take it. That SUV wasn't just Karen's car, it was every ounce of her arrogance. Stuck where it belonged, life settled back into its rhythm. I repaired fences, planted fall crops, and took Rusty down to the creek on long afternoons. The quiet returned, and with it, a peace I'd nearly forgotten was possible. But something else had changed too. The townsfolk treated me differently. At the diner, people slapped me on the back and said, "Heard you gave that HOA lady what for?" At the hardware store, strangers grinned and whispered, "That's the excavator guy," for once. It wasn't pity or awkward silence. It was respect. Even the sheriff gave me a nod one day at the county fair. "Not the way I'd have handled it," he said with a smirk. But I can't say I didn't enjoy the show. Karen, meanwhile, faded into the background. Word was she'd been voted out as HOA president after her neighbors finally grew tired of the lawsuits and tantrums. Without her crown, she shrank. She still lived in the subdivision, but she wasn't marching around with clipboards anymore. Most days she kept her blinds shut and avoided eye contact when she drove by. Sometimes I almost pitied her. Almost. The summer slipped into fall, the air crisp and fields golden with harvest. One cool October evening, I built a fire pit near the barn. Neighbors from both sides of the road came by, subdivision folks and farmers alike. We roasted marshmallows, swapped stories, and laughed until the stars came out. At one point, someone asked, "Reynolds, you ever think of running for HOA president yourself?" The group erupted in laughter before I even answered. "Not in a million years," I said, grinning. "I've got my farm. That's all the kingdom I need." The crowd cheered, and for once, it didn't feel like farmers on one side and subdivision folks on the other. It felt like a community. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat on the porch with Rusty. The air was cool, the fields quiet except for crickets. Across the way, the subdivision windows glowed warm, ordinary, peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened, the trespassing, the threats, the lawsuit, the excavator. It had been hell, but it had also forced me to stand taller than I ever had. Sometimes, battles aren't about winning land or money. Sometimes, they're about holding your ground, even when the world or one loud neighbor tries to shove you off it. Rusty let out a sigh and rested his head on my boot. I scratched behind his ears and smiled into the dark. Karen was quiet now. My farm was mine again. And tomorrow, the sun would rise over the fields just like it always had. Only now, I'd be watching it without a shadow.